Science, the final frontier. These are the voyages of Dr. Victor Grech. His mission? To explore dubious areas of research leading to nearly 100 retractions or withdrawals, including well over a dozen papers about Star Trek published in a medical journal. To seek out new renown and new opportunities. To boldly go where no pediatrician has gone before. In few other professions is one's name so inexorably bound to one's word as it is in science, and academics are under unique pressure to make a name for themselves, to stand out from the crowd by publishing that word in the form of scientific papers. A better curriculum vitae, CV, an academic resume, brings with it not only personal prestige but funding for passion projects, competitive grants, career mobility, and access to the social capital that quietly influences career advancement. Unlike many occupations, from electricians to chefs to software developers, where one's value is judged by practical, tangible output, academia is a world of slow, careful ritual, written in its own language that obfuscates it from those outside of the ivory tower. Impact factors, H-indexes, the abstract metrics that academics use to assign value not just to ideas, but to the people associated with those ideas, carry great weight for scientists. The higher the value of the H-index, the higher the value of the holder of the CV. Entire universities will sell themselves to prospective students, governments, and private investors alike on the name of a single scholar. That's how valuable a name is in academia. The ritual, the ceremony, the cloistered nature of the academy all gives this a sort of mysticism, even for those within who know full well that they're not doing magic, but rather, perhaps, performing a parlor trick for those not bound by the magician's oath to secrecy. Lay people do not often get to see what's behind the curtain, and for good reason. If people cannot trust scientists to accurately report the truth, then in a secular world, who can they trust? This is why retraction, having to remove a flawed paper from the scientific record, is seen as amongst the most severe infractions in academia. The magician has tipped his hand, revealed how the trick was performed, and most importantly, that it was a trick. A retraction means that the mass belief has been unsuspended. This constructed academic mythos in which academics operate knowingly of its farcical nature or not, encourages the perpetuation of the prestige. Thus, one must publish lest he perish. Even well-intentioned scholars, even those already with secure tenure, are expected to go out and perform their wizardry publicly and share their secrets with their fellow magi in private. The problem with this flowery facade is that this is not magic. It's science, and we expect scientific reporting to be reliable and valid. If it is not, then, once again, the mask slips, the performance is over, and the ivory tower crumbles. Thus, let us explore the case of one pediatrician at the University of Malta, who, with over 5,600 citations and 517 papers to his name, is the 28th most published academic at his institution, but ranks amongst the top 2% of scholars worldwide, and who was, over the space of just a few short years, forced to retract, withdraw, or have notices of warning placed on 94 of his papers, at one point landing him a position as one of the top 30 most retracted scholars on Earth. This is the story of how one doctor took advantage of a period of relaxed research publication standards and flooded the field with papers not about pediatrics, but about Star Trek. This is the story of Dr. Victor Grech, the Star Trek scientist. In the early months of 2020, Dr. Grech embarked on a trek to go where no doctor had gone before, likely taking advantage of the chaotic COOF era, when every publication was being bombarded with barrage after barrage of pandemic papers, to publish numerous articles in the Journal of Early Human Development about the most pressing issue of that era, Star Trek. Over the course of a month, between February and March of 2020, Grech published a total of 17 papers explicitly about the science fiction franchise Star Trek, focusing largely on the role of medical professionals across various television shows and films as part of the journal's Best Practice Guidelines, BPG series, intended to provide insights into the best practices pediatricians should follow. Why were these studies published in a journal about early human development, which states its purpose is to provide a, quote, unique opportunity for researchers and clinicians to bridge the communication gap between disciplines, creating a forum for the productive exchange of ideas concerning early human growth and development. The journal publishes original research and clinical papers with particular emphasis on the continuum between fetal life and the perinatal period, aspects of postnatal growth influenced by early events, and the safeguarding of the quality of human survival. Well, it seems that no one knows why he chose to publish Star Trek papers in that journal, including the journal itself, as an editor's note from February of 2021 states that, quote, upon publication of this best practice guideline series, concerns were raised regarding its appropriateness for inclusion in a peer-reviewed academic journal. It is the editor's judgment that this series of articles should not have been accepted for publication by the journal since it is not within its scope. The idea was to engage topics that the ordinary reader of EHD might not normally come across, but could find interesting. The journal has redesigned its editorial and review workflow to ensure that this will not happen again in the future, end quote. So just what were these 17 papers that Dr. Grech felt were appropriate for the journal, even if they were later deemed to be outside of its scope? There were 3 short papers published to the online edition of the journal on February 22nd on the subject of 3 doctors from the television program, which you will notice is a theme here for Dr. Grech. He tends to submit these things in bulk, because most of these papers had already been published in the Science Fiction Research Association, SFRA, and other science fiction-related publications, having been merely edited down and repurposed for publication in the Journal of Early Human Development. Thus, I figure we can start by reviewing them in order of the appearances of these fictional characters, beginning with Dr. Julian Bashir of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Something that immediately stands out is that more than half of this very short paper is comprised entirely of quotes from the character or from other characters speaking about him, or paraphrased quotations, as well as a lengthy quotation from The Lancet about He Jiankui, a Chinese biophysics researcher who claimed to have created the world's first genetically modified human babies.
Isn't that unethical or something? Well...
For which he was fined $430,000 and sentenced to 3 years in prison, as the real-life story is vaguely related to the character in question, Julian Bashir, as Dr. Bashir was illegally genetically modified to enhance his intelligence within the Star Trek universe. The SFRA article from which this paper is directly drawn is even more heavily laden with direct quotations and paraphrasing, making up about 85% of that paper. The remainder of both articles largely exists only to set up the quotations and the paraphrasing, making both little more than a Trek Wikipedia, which does, of course, exist, memory alpha page, with little to no insight nor scholarly value. At least the SFRA paper includes a picture of Dr. Grech posing for a photo with the actor who plays Dr. Bashir, Alexander Siddig. Dr. Grech was so proud of this one particular line that he used it 3 times over, in the EHD's abstract and in its conclusion, as well as in the conclusion of the SFRA article. He was just that proud of this rare moment of slightly original thought, which was, quote, "This doctor reflects a patient's ideal, a superhuman who knows it all. It is abundantly clear that we, the viewers and prospective patients, wish our doctors to boldly go where no medic has gone before, just as long as we are cured." I hope me waxing poetic at the start now makes a little bit more sense. I'm meeting Dr. Grech on his level of pageantry. The next canonical doctor discussed by a paper published on the 22nd by Grech concerns Star Trek Voyager's Emergency Medical Hologram, or EMH, published in the EHD. And now we can start to get a sense of what these articles are all generally going to look like. This one is considerably less riddled with long quotations, but is still nothing more than a series of setups for quotes and paraphrasing. Like the Bashir paper, Grech's few personal contributions are written more like a blog post for a fan magazine than they are for an academic publication, replete with grammatical wonkiness, errors, and exclamation points, exemplified in this quote from its abstract, quote, "An additional bonus is the hardware and software never needs to rest, with 24/7 availability, the patient's ideal. The EMH is truly a unique doctor." And this from its conclusion, quote, "Thus, over the 7 course of the series, the doctor acquires Bildung, with the series serving as a Bildungsroman for a holographic being who is initially unevenly enculturated, grasping some points of expected social behavior or cultural understanding suitable to a given framework while completely missing others. Along the way, the doctor also gains personal development, a multitude of abilities, and the respect of his colleagues. I think we've underestimated him because of our own human limitations. His full potential's unknown. The EMH is truly a unique doctor. In addition to the word unique here, Dr. Grech seems quite fond of the term Bildungsroman, which describes stories that focus on a character's development from childhood into adulthood, hence his use of the term in both the Bashir and the EMH articles, seemingly in an attempt to make them fit thematically, even in the mildest of senses, to the journal's theme of human development. While you could perhaps make this argument for Voyager's EMH, who begins the series as a computer program with no ability to leave the confines of the ship's medical bay, limited free will, able to be turned off by the ship's personnel at any point, and at very best questionable sentience, he ends the show with full mobility, the crew understanding and respecting his wishes not to be turned off, at least most of the time, and a fleshed-out personality that the crew recognizes as sentient. He's probably thereby the best case across Doctor characters, spanning the entire franchise, to depict a Bildungsroman. The EMH Doctor is, in a sense, a child at the beginning of Voyager, being but a naive bit of software, manifesting in physical space with light and energy projections. But by the end, he is largely treated as a full and vital member of the crew. This is only the case for the EMH, however, and not for Julian Bashir, who, while a young prodigy, is not a child nor an adolescent when Deep Space Nine opens. It seems clear to me that the use of the term Bildungsroman has been included in these papers in an attempt to legitimize them as being appropriate for a medical journal concerned with the fetal through perinatal development of humans. None of the characters are fetuses or infants, and although there is an episode of The Next Generation, Rascals, that sees certain members of the cast reverted to children, none of the de-aged characters were medical officers. It seems that the Bildungsroman was the best excuse that Grech could muster to justify submitting these fan Wikipedia articles to a medical journal. My best guess is that Grech probably started this whole debacle by writing this specific paper about the EMH for this journal, suffering from lockdown restlessness perhaps, because there is some vague argument that the holographic doctor is born over the course of the show, and realized that if he could stretch the definition of a Bildungsroman character arc into one publication, he could probably stretch it into a couple of publications and pad out his curriculum vitae, his resume, in the process. The third paper, published on the 22nd, however, does not describe a Bildungsroman arc at all, focusing its less than 600 words on the character Hugh Culber from Star Trek Discovery, and instead focusing on his most notable feature, his homosexuality.
This is funny! He's gay!
We have now completely left the premise of human fetal to perinatal development behind us in this ostensible academic Jeffries tube. The brief differs from the others in that there is virtually no description made of Culber besides the fact that he's gay. Because, well, he doesn't live very long, which upset some fans who were excited for the representation. The rest of the article concerns homosexual representation in general and descriptions of the show's plot. I have not watched Star Trek Discovery because why would I do that? And I now know just about as much about this character after reading Grech's article as I did before reading it. That's how sparse it is. Further, there is absolutely no argument nor excuse in the brief as to why this essentially blog post was appropriate for a medical journal, and yet they published it as part of this BPG series. The next day, a new paper appeared in the EHD, this time not centered around a sole character, but instead on, quote, doctors in Star Trek, non-benevolent and inhumane alien medics, fleetingly mentioning some examples of unethical medical professionals across the series. The first, Star Trek Enterprise's Dr. Phlox in the Mirror Universe episode, eventually got his own paper from Dr. Grech, and just describes the plot of that particular episode. The subsequent examples, Hirogen medics, Borg medical drones, Vidian and Voth surgeons, Quora memory manipulators, as well as unethical Cardassian and Federation experimentations, are similarly nothing more than plot summaries. The paper goes on to mention Vulcan doctors and Klingon healers, without even attempting to relate them to the topic of medical ethics. A fifth of the total length of the paper is dedicated to a single quotation. The following day, February 24th, saw a surge, with 4 papers about specific characters published to the journal in addition to one musing about how medicine and doctors may be different in the future. Beginning with the OG, Dr. Leonard McCoy from Star Trek, the original series, played by DeForest Kelley. The paper provides a biography of the fictional physician, his emphasis on compassionate humanity in contrast typically to Spock's cold and rigid logic, his distrust of technology, and his various catchphrases. there is no attempt to link this summary of McCoy to the journal's subject matter, nor even to the building's romance story arc. It's just a description of old sawbones. This one is sparser on direct quotes, but still bears zero resemblance to an academic paper. Most importantly to me is that despite the simplicity of the paper, even the title is wrong, describing McCoy as being from Star Trek: The Next Generation. DeForest Kelley did make a brief appearance in the series' two-part debut, Encounter at Farpoint, but is a solid fixture of the original series and its films, not The Next Generation. Given that two of the other papers published on the 24th were about doctors from TNG, I imagine this was just a mistake, but understand the level of absurdity that we're operating at for me to be discussing the canonical inaccuracies of a character from a science fiction television show being discussed in relationship with a paper published in a scientific journal for fetal and perinatal medicine. As mentioned, the error in the title may have been a mix-up with the next doctor of interest in Dr. Rex series for the Journal of Early Human Development, Beverly Crusher, played by Gates McFadden. This article is another brief character summary describing her background, ethics, caring nature, and her apparent importance to the series as a woman in a position of authority, in sharp contrast to the country doctor masculine persona of Dr. McCoy. Once again, there isn't even an attempt to tie this short article, mostly comprised of quotes and descriptions, to the subject of the journal itself. Our third character spotlight of the day was Dr. Helen Pulaski, who temporarily replaced Crusher as the Enterprise D's physician. Dr. Grech describes her biography and her contrast to Crusher being essentially a female version of McCoy, intended to placate fans who disliked McFadden's character. As with many of the other articles in this set, previously published elsewhere, this paper was adapted from a post Grech made to his website, Synapse, in 2013, and around 95% of it is quotations or paraphrasing, with almost no original input from Grech himself. Rounding out the list, another character who received a dedicated article on the 24th is Dr. Phlox of Star Trek Enterprise. As with the other three, this is little more than a short character biography, with few unique words from Grech on how anything he is shown to do or experience over the course of the show could in any way relate to early human development, particularly in this case given that he is an alien, and that characteristic is the main focus of Grech's article. Grech's fifth paper published on the 24th is titled Doctors in Star Trek: Reflections on the Changing Faces of Future Doctors, and is the only one of the Star Trek papers published in the journal that has been withdrawn at the request of the editors, which is the peculiar way that Elsevier journals describe retractions. Most journals would describe an article removed by the editors against the explicit directive of the authors as a retraction, but again, Elsevier calls this act a withdrawal. As this article is just more of the same, I'm unsure as to why it was the sole paper deemed worthy of removal, but if I were to guess, it's probably because it's a summary of the previous articles published over the past few days, except instead of spending a few hundred words, mostly on quotations dedicated to a single character, it dedicates a few dozen to each one. The conclusion reached by Dr. Grech is that Star Trek characters reflect the era in which they were created, and concludes that given more recent physicians in the program are less emotional and increasingly calculating, that patients have come to expect their own doctors to be more machine than man. Although not published until a month later in May, the 5 aforementioned papers were part of a special issue of the Journal of Early Human Development, which also contained a profile on Drs. Boyce and Piper, who appeared in the 2 pilot episodes of the original series, The Cage and Where No Man Has Gone Before. Given that these characters did not go on to become cast members of the show, there is little to be said about them beyond the raw descriptions of their actions, roles, and lines in the 2 episodes. This paper was also lifted directly from an article published in Vector in 2013, a critical/academic imprint of the British Science Fiction Association. Once again, there is nothing novel, of academic interest, or even of unique insight in this paper, which might as well be an AI overview of the characters. The 145th volume of EHD, formerly published in June of 2020, contains another special issue dedicated to Dr. Grech's Star Trek ramblings, with 6 additional articles. Medical Nanotechnology in Star Trek, a force for both good and evil, is another series of short descriptions of the different types of, well, medical nanotechnology used in Star Trek, including that used by the Borg and the Federation, representing, for Grech, Manichaean dualism, good and evil, and he muses on the Faustian consequences of developing and using such technology. It also is not a new article, as it was repurposed from an article published in SFRA in 2018, which is largely identical to the EHD publication in substance, but is far longer and consists, again, largely of direct quotations or paraphrasing of characters from the program. Staying on at least something of a theme besides Star Trek, and certainly not on topic for the journal in which it was published, the paper Artificial Intelligence in Medicine may appear to a reader just coming across the headline to be about the use of large language models or other types of computer assistance programs in medicine. But, of course, it's not. It's about Star Trek. Sort of. The bulk of the paper is a short description of the history of AI development as well as its current use in medical diagnostics and interventions. There is then another lengthy segment describing the differences between what he calls weak and strong AI, whether or not an AI is merely a program or if it can be considered sentient, relating the topic back to Star Trek with a mention of Voyager's emergency medical hologram. The irony here is, of course, that this paper reads like it was written by an AI, given a prompt to write a short article about AI, Star Trek, and medicine. But I'm fairly sure it hasn't been, not only because of when it was published, which was before access to LLMs was quite as ubiquitous as it would soon become, but because it also just contains the hallmarks of Greck's personal writing. Lots of quotations, little substance. And because it too is not an original work, having been published in a longer format in the New York Review of Science Fiction in 2016. Evil Doctor, Ethical Android, Star Trek's instantiation of conscious in subroutines, begins by again discussing the differences between weak and strong AI, and then moves into a description of the android character of Data and a summary of various events across episodes and films that the character has appeared in, specifically Descent, Parts 1 and 2, and Star Trek Insurrection, which wrestle with the ethical issues of Data's sentience and capacity for evil. Grech goes on to do the same using 2 episodes of Star Trek Voyager, Latent Image and Darkling, to discuss the same subject matter, but instead focusing on the EMH. Grech then waxes poetic himself about when machines become moral agents, and proceeds to cite heavily from the book Moral Machines Teaching Robots Right from Wrong, concluding his paper by asking the reader whether or not we should cautiously program where no programmer has coded before.
Computer, generate a replica of Counselor Deanna Troi at age 38 after bearing 3 children. Make her 200 feet tall and generate a medieval landscape. Computer, place her several kilometers away and load her into a catapult that is powerful enough to launch her into the air. Make sure her legs are spread.
Nurses in Star Trek, the fictional role of the nurse in Star Trek, is also exactly what it says on the tin, a description of 2 nurses from the series, Nurse Chapel from the original, and Nurse Ogawa from TNG. Ogawa barely has any speaking lines, and serves largely as Crusher's silent assistant, making her essentially a non-character, while Nurse Chapel was primarily there to serve as a will they won't they love interest for Mr. Spock, being played by Gene Roddenberry's wife, Majel Barrett, who would go on to play the role of Loaxana Troi in The Next Generation. Dr. Grech throws in a couple lines discussing the role of women in medicine and nursing specifically as a traditionally female profession, and once more, this article is a truncated version of a piece that Grech had previously published in SFRA in 2014. Another curious entry is the banality of evil in the occupation of Star Trek's Bajor. Or should I say Bayor, as that's how it's spelled in the Sci-Hub backup, but correctly in the EHD. I cannot say for sure if this error, spelling the fictional planet Bajor as Bayor, was Grech's mistake, that of the journal initially, or that of whoever uploaded it to Sci-Hub. However, the document on Sci-Hub was created on the 13th of March 2020, and the file denotes it as a quote, corrected proof, but the paper was not made available online in EHD until the 16th, meaning that this likely was the original spelling of the planet in the paper, and therefore most likely Grech's mistake. Bajor is spelled accurately in the paper itself, but that makes 2 papers in this set that contain an error in the very title, and it's an error so sloppy and amateurish that it actually somewhat calls Grech's Trekkie cred into consideration. Saying that McCoy is from The Next Generation is not entirely inaccurate, and easily explainable due to the paper being submitted in bulk alongside the Crusher paper, but this appears to just be Grech spelling the name of the fictional planet he's writing about in a scientific journal about fetal and perinatal medicine incorrectly. The abstract of the paper begins by mentioning Adolf Eichmann and Joseph Mengele, providing short biographies of both historical Nazi figures, and sets the scene for the paper's tone and purpose. The majority of this paper is comprised of a summary of the events of the Deep Space Nine episode, Duet, which follows the story of a Cardassian file clerk, Eamon Maritza, who is suspected to be the false identity assumed by war criminal Gul Darheel, a man who tortured and killed countless Bajorans in a Cardassian labor camp during the planet's occupation. The episode doesn't need Grek's analysis, as paltry as it is, to make the Nazi allusions clear. They are overt in the episode itself, which is probably why this section is mostly direct, lengthy quotations from the show. It is worth noting, however, that the role medicine plays in this episode, while pivotal to the plot as the true identity of the Cardassian in question is revealed to actually be that of the guilt-ridden file clerk and not Gul Darheel, due to him having developed a rare disorder only found in camp survivors and personnel present during a specific tragic event, is overall minimal. Neither Darheel nor Maritza nor anyone else involved beyond the station's doctor, Bashir, who identifies this medical incongruity, is in any way involved in the practice of medicine. Duet generally ranks as amongst the best episodes of Star Trek Deep Space Nine by fans, and is, in my opinion, one of the most skillfully written and marvelously performed episodes in the entire franchise. But it is not a medical or science-heavy episode. And as such, the paper has nothing to do with early human development, nor with the practice of medicine more broadly. It's just a paper summarizing 2 episodes of Star Trek. The other episode summarized in this paper is Nothing Human from Star Trek Voyager, which concerns the crimes of a different Cardassian, this time one who actually is a medical doctor, and whose personality has been copied and made into a holographic representation of the real fictional person, tackling the ethical question of whether or not a copy of a person is guilty of that person's actions, even though the copy did not personally commit them, all put far more eloquently in the Oni Plays Tiny Hitler debate.
If you had a clone of Hitler, would you torture it?
No, why not just say if you had a tiny little Hitler?
Because
No, listen, if it's a clone, I wouldn't, because that person didn't commit the actions. It's a genetic clone.
He did.
Ultimately, in April of 2021, the Journal of Early Human Development did not retract the BPG Star Trek papers, but did attach an editor's note to all of them, designating the papers as outside of the journal's scope and apologizing for the confusion. Of course, given that these papers were not retracted and remain up and available on Elsevier and elsewhere, it's difficult to take their promise to improve the journal's quality much more seriously than the papers themselves. I cannot say for sure what motivated Dr. Grech to publish these largely repurposed, meaningless papers, nor what motivated the Journal of Early Human Development to publish them. As far as I can tell, there are no public connections between Grech and any of the editors or reviewers at the journal, and seriously calls into question the validity of the journal altogether. At least if there was some cronyism going on here, then that would be something that could be ameliorated by the journal by cleaning house, but the problem seems to run deeper. Maybe this medical journal will quite literally publish anything, and that includes 17 papers that are little more than descriptions of Star Trek characters and episodes, with less information than one could find on a Wikipedia page, and certainly less than a Memory Alpha page. Or maybe it's because Dr. Grech is one of the most published scholars in Malta, and ranks in the top 2% worldwide, and as such, his name carries weight. When a paper comes across your desk as a journal editor that's just summaries of episodes of Star Trek, you can probably guess who submitted it, and know that his name carries weight. Then again, it is academia, and it is Star Trek. The Venn diagram is damn near a perfect circle, perhaps a pussifer or even a late-era tool. The purpose of blind peer review is to avoid favoritism towards any author for any reason, but when your medical journal receives a bunch of submissions about Star Trek, there's just no way for peer review to be anonymized. Everyone working at the journal could almost assuredly tell which papers were Grech's, and as he is an academically affluent scholar, they likely were showing him significant favoritism. Regarding Grech himself, once again my best guess here is that Victor had something of an idea on how to sell these papers to the journal, beyond the fact that he knew that they knew who was submitting them, and the weight that his name carries, but he could perhaps spin the papers as being related to pediatrics via the Buildings Realm 1 framework, that again chiefly only applies to Voyager's EMH. There have been few better times throughout history to get away with publishing junk research than during 2020, when the world was hanging on every word of scientists, and Grech may have taken advantage of that reality of the age in addition to the lax publication standards present at the time due to the sheer mass influx of papers being submitted to journals. The pandemic era was a perfect time for someone like Grech to add more than a dozen articles to his curriculum vitae over the course of just a couple months, all published in what would otherwise seem like a serious medical journal. If the editors are to be believed in their own remarks about the papers, the intention in publishing them was to draw in new readers, but again, this isn't a light-reading sci-fi magazine. It's a scientific publication. Despite a lack of formal affiliations, it seems unquestionable that someone at the EHD just likes Dr. Grech or wants him to like them, as Grech published a total of 113 papers in the journal and 57 as a sole author, taking all of that glory for himself. But what honor is there in publishing your fan Wikia articles as if they were medical discoveries?
Doctor, there is no need to insult me.
The same issue of the EHD that featured a second set of Star Trek papers also included a paper written by Grech about the disease, published on April 10th, 2020, which was subsequently withdrawn by Grech but is listed officially and in big bold red letters as a retraction, not a withdrawal. Attributable again to Elsevier's somewhat strange policy of only considering a paper retracted if it had been formally published and not just posted online as a preprint. This paper, COVID-19 Admissions Calculators, General Population and Pediatric Cohort, predicts approximately how many people, and specifically young children, will be likely to be admitted to hospital with COVID over the course of the pandemic, based on an estimated total of 80,000 children between 1 and 16 years of age in Malta. Grech predicted that 0.6% of that population would suffer from a severe case of COVID. Depending on the rates of infection, on the low end, a 20% infection rate would annually place 96 children in hospital. An 80% infection rate would annually risk the lives of 834 minors. Based on a total world population of about 8 billion, although that estimate too has come under some recent scrutiny, had Grech's predictions been true, that's 1.2 million children at some serious health risk from the COOF. Were one to apply broad mortality rates of child admissions to hospital, which range from 1.8% in the US to 7.6% in Brazil, between 17.6 and 72.6 million children would have been estimated to have become severely sick based on Grech's hypothesis. In reality, about 17,000, not 17 million, children died during the pandemic as a result of it. A horrific tragedy, but nowhere near the numbers that Grech had anticipated. For that outcome, the infection mortality rate of based on an estimated total population of 2 billion children under the age of 16 is 0.0000087, not 0.6. Dr. Grech retracted the paper himself, but it is labeled as a retraction, not a withdrawal, with Grech explaining these numbers were based on very early estimates, which, to be fair, they were. However, you can see why such a figure would be alarming and hence why it needed to be retracted, as it was fairly swiftly in August of 2020. But not before Elsevier's Twitter accounts had tweeted about it twice, tweets which were themselves later deleted. Grech also updated some of his calculations with more recent information, which the journal published again on the 25th of April, this time predicting hospitalizations for 0.002% of children 16 and under at the upper limit of infection and 0.0005% at the lower limit of infection rates. Only to retract that paper as well, again for overestimating the figures. In reality, in Malta, 5 people died during the first wave of out of 482 reported cases, and those that did were not children, but instead were all elderly, as per Grech's own later reporting. While the editors applied a note to 17 of Grech's papers published in the EHD that were predominantly concerned with Star Trek, there were a total of 22 made to the journal that mentioned it, including one simply titled Editorial, which is an overview of what he planned to cover in the Star Trek Best Practice series, stating, quote, "This author considered it constructive to examine the doctors from Star Trek in the viewpoint of a medical doctor, and felt comfortable doing so with a doctorate in English language. Since the Star Trek series spans several decades, there has been a continual change in the perception of the Doctor, reflecting the zeitgeist, the spirit of the time." Which, if true, makes it seem as if at least part of the reason for publishing these papers, outside of getting to add a publication to his CV, was an excuse to show off his English language skills. And that too is rather ironic, as although I've not mentioned it much up until this point, Greck's papers are littered with small but persistent grammatical errors, scattered in between $5 words. In this paper, Grech also laments that science fiction is not being taken seriously into consideration by scientists as a respectable area of interest. Unfortunately, with 17 papers on Star Trek effectively retracted, Grech's work has probably not contributed positively to that perception. This would not be Grech's only brush with controversy and retraction as it concerned the COOF, but nor was it the end of the issues with his publications in the Journal of Early Human Development. On the 5th of February 2021, the editors of EHD added a note to 48 papers published in the journal by Grech as part of another series apart from the Best Practice Guidelines one that he used to publish his Star Trek blog, titled Write a Scientific Paper, or WASP. Thus, let's turn our attention to Grech's advice to other scholars on how to do just that, write a scientific paper, something that he seems to so excel at, after all, by examining the first duty of every scientist, to publish. The Write a Scientific Paper series is designed to help junior medical and nursing staff become better at writing and presenting their work, to create effective graphs and tables, as well as to follow mandatory medical research guidelines. Yes, Dr. Grech, whose own writing in the journal included over a dozen papers summarizing characters and plots from a science fiction television franchise, sought to tell others how to write for scientific medical publications. I mean, you can't really argue with his success. Most of these articles are introductions to basic concepts of academic publication and statistics, such as using histograms, plotting data, pivot and contingency tables, data entry and validation, t-distribution and tests, standard error and confidence intervals, quartiles and standard deviation, correlation, odds ratio, ANOVA, regression, Poisson and nominal distributions, multivariate analysis, etc. All of the things that you'll learn in an introductory master's level statistics course in the social sciences, and probably in undergrad if you're not in the social sciences like I am. It also contains entries on academic writing more broadly, offering advice on how to structure a scientific paper, how to write a thesis, how to prepare an abstract, how to present research at conference using posters and PowerPoint,
bad communists and so on.
While this would all be a bit strange to publish in most academic journals that aren't explicitly related to pedagogy, what's more is that the focus of the series began to deviate from its stated goals over time. There are articles sprinkled throughout the set such as Interdisciplinarity as it may become, as visualized in science fiction, which is a review of how various fictional characters utilize interdisciplinary approaches to science. His list of examples includes Heinlein's Beyond the Horizon, Asimov's The Dead Past, and of course, Star Trek, with the latter focusing on the interdisciplinary skills of the characters of Spock and Data. I get it, Victor, they're my favorites too, but this not only has nothing to do with early human development, it has nothing to do with how to write a scientific paper either. Another paper from the WASP series appears to perhaps actually be a mislabeled part of his BPG Trek series, titled Doctors in Star Trek, Correctly Compassionate, Caring, Kantian, Zampolit, as it is much more akin to those Trek papers, and again makes no attempt to offer any real writing advice for young scholars. Kantian Zampolit isn't an obscure but beloved science fiction character, like Scrimblow Bimblow or Glup Shitto, but rather is a combination of Kantian, as in the ethics of Immanuel Kant, concerned less with ethical laws and consequences of action, but rather on the ethical intent behind those actions, along with the term Zampolit, Soviet commissars. In Grech's framework, the doctors of Star Trek are the Zampolit of the United Federation of Planets. Therefore, he sees the doctors of Star Trek as the enforcers of Federation ethics over either pragmatism or alternative ethical perspectives. Upon reading this, the first example that came to my mind, and one that Grech also writes of in his paper, is the case of Tuvix from the eponymous Star Trek Voyager episode, where a transporter accident causes two of the show's characters, the ship's quirky, oft annoying, but friendly to a fault volunteer morale officer, Neelix, and the reserved, logical to a fault Vulcan security officer Tuvok, who, being polar opposites, often have a strained interpersonal relationship, into a hybrid of both characters, Tuvix. Captain Janeway wants to separate them as to have her two senior officers back to normal, but also because the crew is just off-put by Tuvix as an entity, which you can detect yourself by well, looking at him. The EMH doctor refuses to perform the separation procedure based on Federation ethics guidelines, which, being a Federation hologram himself, a computer program, he lacks the ability to violate, because Tuvix is a new, unique, sentient being, and to separate him back into his component parts requisitely will require ending the life of Tuvix. To date, Tuvix is one of the most controversial episodes of Star Trek Voyager, with fans still debating whether Janeway or the Doctor was correct. Let me know which side of the debate you're on in the comments below and viciously fight each other for dominance in the Kali Phi. To describe the role of physicians in Star Trek as Kantian Zampolit is perhaps revealing of Grek's personal politics, as he seems to praise this general portrayal of doctors within the franchise as enforcement agents of state morality, even in the face of opposition from their superior officers. For Grek, the role of a doctor, considering this was published in his series on how academics should approach research, should be that of the Kantian Zampolit, a commissar of the state bound by ethical duty. Draw from that whatever you think he means. Another paper from Grek's CV, published in the EHD, that one wouldn't expect to be about Star Trek, but still devotes words to talking about it, is Ethical Issues and Data Protection in Research, which dedicates a small section to again describe Starfleet medical officers as Kantian Zampolits. So this appears to be a consistent perspective on Starfleet medical personnel. Would you be surprised to learn then, dear viewer, what Grek's position on Kuf jabs are? Well, he was an outspoken and avid supporter of the Fauci ouchies for both adults and children, not only in his appearances on Maltese television, but in his academic writing as well, emphasizing the need for pro-vax information campaigns, especially amongst younger and hesitant healthcare workers.
We don't yet know, there's no information. But for those between 5 and 12, the plan is 2 doses. Will they all need a booster? I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. Do you want to gamble with your son or daughter playing Russian roulette with the every time it comes around once, 3, 4 times a year? I'm not willing to do that. And I'm speaking in the most selfish way possible here about my own children. When they get sick, it's not just them who are affected. They end up staying with the grandparents, right? If they have, they're incubating it and passing it on to their grandparents or to you. If numbers go up, a proportion of them will end up in hospital and we'll have problems. The problem then is that we'll have to cut back on the hospital's routine work. That means be people who are vaccinated, who did their part, who've been careful, and who need an intervention like cancer treatment. Sorry, but the hospital is full of patients. That's the problem. So we have to be careful because it will affect everyone. You might think, oh, I've had so I'm fine. So what? We know what happens. You can get it again.
Forget all this. We're desperate for a vaccine. The world has stopped for lack of one vaccine. So I'd like to take this opportunity, if I may, for the anti-vaxxers out there to say, we told you so. World is not flat and the sky is blue. Okay? I've got that off my chest. Now I can continue. The other issue is that America, having money to burn, has made contracts with all of the vaccine manufacturers so that they get first take of the vaccine. Having said that, the polls show that half of these people who live in the most developed country in the world probably won't take the vaccine even if it's made available. So actually, they may not take that many doses because this is the United States of, God bless us, America. So the less they take, the more there is for us. But silver lining, what can I say?
Perhaps Grek sees himself as the Kantian Zampolit. Another essay from the set, To Strive, to Seek, to Find, and Not to Yield, provides some insight into Grek's personality, including his approach to medicine, which sees him quoting Alfred Tennyson, Machiavelli, and William Osler, alongside Kirk, Spock, and Picard, all with the same degree of gravitas. He summarizes and concludes his stance in the paper with a variation on the famous Star Trek opening monologue, that the Doctor's mission is to, quote, explore strange new diseases, seek out new patients and new maladies, boldly cure where no man has gone before. Other pieces in the series reveal even more of Grek's approach to academic publication. In Kleos Aptheton, Eternal Glory and Renown, or Nostos, he discusses what he describes as every young academic's Achillean choice. Publish unevocative mainstream papers that will propel their careers, or publish based on passion, with papers that go against the grain, saying that the latter is a more onerous, but ultimately satisfying path, and simply more fun. Which again says a lot more about Grek's own approach to publication, more than it does anything else.
Remember, kids, The first rule of gun safety is to always have fun.
Once again, here he quotes Plato alongside Blade Runner, The Lord of the Rings, Doctor Strange, Mad Max, and obviously, Star Trek. Grech mentions the publish or perish paradigm again in WASP, a career-critical skill. Publications are a requirement for advancement in academia, particularly if one hopes to land a tenured position, and thus the publish or perish paradigm encourages scholars to publish anything they can manage to get out the gate, as it adds to the perceived value of their curriculum vitae. The paper itself, however, is a simplistic explanation of how to use Microsoft Excel to perform basic statistical calculations.
Kelly Rowland weighing in on her texting via Excel to Nelly in their Dilemma music video.
It's as normal as you want it to be.
In his WASP article on academic hoaxes, such as the Sokol affair, and scientific fraud, the latter of which one could argue that Grech was guilty of by publishing all of this nonsense in a medical journal, likely as a result of that self-same publish or perish paradigm, by the way, Grech condemns the practice. Given that Grech would go on to earn a spot, at least temporarily, on the list of the top 30 most retracted authors scoreboard of Retraction Watch, it rings a bit hollow when he says things such as, quote, "Academics have an ethical responsibility to ensure the highest, uncompromising standards of research design, data collection, analysis, interpretation, and reporting. Failure to do so harms patients and the cause of science, with resultant public lack of faith in its health institutions." Grech is correct here. Bad publications do harm the cause of science. You know, like he was doing here. Perhaps even more ironic is his statement on hoaxes, which, again, depending on how one defines a hoax, may also describe what Grech was doing in the EHD, stating, quote, "While it may seem amusing and clever to entrap colleagues in a hoax, the repercussions may have chronic and unintended consequences. Outright fraud may result in short-term gain, but will almost inevitably, quite simply, lead to the destruction of one's career, along with the potential for exposure to criminal charges." I don't think what Grech did here was criminal or anything, just opportunistic, but I can't say it isn't at least a little bit amusing to imagine him before a court in a Star Trek uniform, receiving a dressing down from a judge reciting Picard's speech from First Duty.
"The first duty of every Starfleet officer is to the truth, whether it's scientific truth, or historical truth, or personal truth. It is the guiding principle on which Starfleet is based. If you can't find it within yourself, to stand up and tell the truth about what happened, you don't deserve to wear that uniform."
Seemingly unable to contain his fixation on fictional characters, and also characteristic of his overuse of quotations from fictional works, Grech put a pause on his WASP series in 2019 by stating, quote, "Like Superman's father, we hope that we have given you an ideal to strive towards. They will race behind you, they will stumble, they will fall. But in time, they will join you in the sun. In time, you will help them accomplish wonders." While the sentiment is sweet and likely encouraging for new scholars, it comes off as a bit disingenuous in the broader context of whatever it was that Grech was doing in the Journal of Early Human Development, which is difficult to see as anything other than misguided at best or opportunistic at worst. Similarly to how the journal handled the issue of Grech's BPG Trek papers, an editor's note was attached to all of the WASP papers in April of 2021 with the same blanket statement as the one they applied to the Star Trek publications, saying the articles were outside of the journal's scope. While it's true that these papers are not sullying science with incorrect information, they do contribute to academic bloat and the issue of artificial inflation of CVs with papers of poor quality that plagues academia, serving essentially as useless noise. It would be perfectly fine for Grech to have published these articles in science fiction-related journals and outlets, as he had previously done with many of those he submitted to the Journal of EHD. However, EHD is not a science fiction journal. It is a quantitative, empirical, medical journal, and as such, the very existence of these papers in the publication diminishes the overall health of medical articles. When a paper that consists largely of reprinted sections of transcriptions from a science fiction TV show appears in a publication next to one on, say, the longitudinal effects of gestational age on academic performance in children born preterm, it reduces the credibility of other articles published in the journal, as well as medical articles more broadly. Would you trust the veracity of anything published in the Journal of Early Human Development, knowing what you know about what they have elected to publish? Sure, the Mass Effect trilogy is great, but do you want to pre-order Andromeda 2? When it concerns a public health issue in particular, the credibility of scientists is imperative. seemingly very much by Greg's own understanding, as he describes in his ideal Kantian Zampolit Doctor. Which is why, while these science fiction papers and basic tips for publication are in the broad scheme of things, and for the state of academia in general, inconsequential, Greg's other work on the COOF, much of which was retracted, and not just withdrawn nor given a polite editor's note, is particularly important because it, in some small part, does contribute to the general reduction in trust that people place in scientists to objectively report the truth to the best of their ability, which fell drastically during the pandemic years. As such, let's look at the actual scientific papers that Greg published in this same journal, concerned not so much with science fiction, but with actual science. At least, allegedly. Not content to merely publish his sci-fi blog in a medical journal, Dr. Greg published 29 papers on the COOF in the outlet on the heels of his Best Practice Guidelines Star Trek series. 1, technically 2 as it was resubmitted, of which we've already covered, that were all similarly, eventually, withdrawn or retracted. I should note that neuroscience research has indicated that people really do not like thinking about this particular period in recent history, nor does the YouTube algorithm. And I completely understand why, because I don't really like thinking about it either. Although I believe that we should, and that it is not, as the New York Times described this tendency, a good thing. Thus, I'm not going to go into any specifics here outside of Greg's retracted or withdrawn papers, and to please the algo, am going to be very light on my use of the specific term for the disease. As such, I will be using the word COOF to refer to it. I know, this is annoying and infantilizing, my apologies, but that's just the way that one must go about engaging with anything related to this particular topic. The first of Greg's COOF papers to come under scrutiny was Countering Fake News in the COOF Era, the public opinion on the role of an honest and reliable website, published in November of 2020, which was a survey of users of a Maltese Facebook group and specifically its associated website, both titled The COOF As It Happens, which was created in March of 2020 for the purpose of disseminating medically accurate information about the disease to the lay public. So what was the survey? Surely something like a comparative analysis of the accuracy of users of the site with regards to current information about the situation compared to the general public, or something similar, right? No, it was just a survey about how users felt about the website, a simple feedback form. If you care, and honestly I can't imagine why anyone would to a degree that it would warrant an academic publication for it, people generally liked the now defunct website, and mostly found out about it from social media, including one person directly from Greg's own Facebook page. That's it. That's the study. It was withdrawn at some point in March of 2021 with no reason given. Despite both attempts to publish his inflated estimates of mortality rates both being retracted or withdrawn, Greg continued to publish research on the deadliness of the disease in The COOF is Ageist, Sexist, Ruthless, Dispassionate, and Opportunistic, Protecting Our Vulnerable, published in October of 2020. While the title is titillating, and perhaps revealing, it's not what you might expect from a paper with such a name. It's a literature review of extant data on the vulnerability of patients with comorbidities to the novel virus. Well, being a pediatrician, Greg's previous work had largely concerned the virus in children. As the pandemic waged on and actual numbers started coming in that disproved Greg's hypothesis that children would be heavily affected, this paper instead focused on those who actually died or became seriously ill, which in Malta by October were only the elderly and disproportionately 59.23% male. Greg's short review was conducted by searching PubMed and Google Scholar for the terms vulnerable population, non-communicable diseases, and multimorbidity, and found yes, people with existing comorbidities were more susceptible to serious infirmity. Given that 33.01% of the adult Maltese population possesses some non-communicable underlying medical issue, Greg predicted that the island may be particularly vulnerable to the COOF, and concludes his short review by suggesting countries focus on surveillance, risk assessments, follow-ups, and prevention in populations with comorbidities. It was withdrawn in March of 2021 with no reason given. Are you starting to notice some themes here as well? Returning to his area of expertise, not science fiction but pediatrics, In November, Grech published another COOF paper in the Journal of Early Human Development, in a rare instance of keeping within the scope of the publication, titled COOF-Related Acute Decline in Pediatric Admissions in Malta, a population-based study. Here, Grech compares baseline pediatric admissions to Malta's only acute general hospital before and during the pandemic, with the data far from aligning with his initial estimates. Grech now had to report that rather than being particularly dangerous for children, that during the pandemic, hospital admissions for children decreased from the baseline by 63.5%, alongside a decrease from 70.3% in 2019 to 42.2% in 2020 in reported communicable infections in children that coincided with school closures. As one might expect, kids aren't in school, they contract fewer colds and flus. The rates of neonatal admissions, however, did slightly but statistically significantly increase by 5.25%, as did reported cases of child abuse requiring hospitalization, from 0.14% of cases in 2019 to 3.5% in 2020, over a 300% increase. Much as with the decrease in communicable disease from not being in school, being at home all day also seems to have increased the prevalence of child abuse. In total, there was a negative relationship between reported cases of the COOF in Malta and daily pediatric admissions. I can respect Dr. Grech for changing his stance on the risks to children posed by the pandemic, which is far more than some scholars would be willing to do. However, given that the evidence of his prior vast overestimations of the danger of the disease in juveniles had been scrubbed from the academic record, an outside observer would have to look fairly deep in that record to detect this change in tune. Regardless, for some unspecified reason, Grech withdrew this paper in March of 2021 as well. In November of 2020, Grech published The COOF, Its Novel Vaccination and Fake News, What a Brew, which gives us more insights into his political stances as they related to the novel virus. The paper begins with a description of post-truth and emotional or emo truth, the latter term deriving from a non-scientific critical cultural journal which categorizes emotional truth, more commonly known as rumors, as a distinctly right-wing populist phenomenon.
Oh, what is your beef with the mattress?
Grech elaborates on emo truth as a, quote, aggressive masculine performance of trustworthiness, corresponding to a code for recognizing it, resulting in a legitimized status of the popular truth teller and at odds with more official, scientific, institutional truth tellers. Deeply ironic considering all of the nonsense that he published under the auspices of science. Grech further posits that toxic masculinity manifests in politicians and people alike in their tendency to diminish the severity of the virus, despite himself having to walk back his overestimations of its severity, pointing to Trump and Bolsonaro's support for chloroquine as an example of how this tendency promotes the spread of misinformation. Oh please, the last time toxic masculinity manifested inside a politician, a Democrat Senate staffer got fired. He similarly describes the politicization of masks as a manifestation of toxic masculinity in its emphasis on individual liberty, contrasted to the government tyranny of enforced behaviors for the good of the many, or so Grech believes. Of course, we know that in hindsight, and really we knew at the time, that the cloth masks most people wore during the pandemic did little to stop the spread, but here what would turn out to be valid skepticism about the efficacy of masks is depicted as a harmful disregard for the truth, and instead as a manifestation of toxic masculinity. Because the truth, for Grech, is that jab hesitancy is absurd, and that jabs should be prioritized over alternative treatments, in which he compares research on the promotion of chloroquine, which did turn out to not be an effective treatment for the COOF, to the plot of the film Contagion, which features forsythia, a floral homeopathic tincture as a cure for the fictional disease in the film, despite no evidence of its efficacy. The comparison downplays the importance of chloroquine as an essential medicine for the treatment of malaria, contributing to the misinformation about the drug amongst medical professionals and the general public alike. The irony that he does so in a paper on the threat posed by misinformation is certainly not lost on me. Speaking of, another area where Grech detects toxic masculinity is in jab hesitancy, stating fairly definitively in this paper published again in November of 2020 that the Oxford jab trial, what would go on to become the AstraZeneca, had only minimal short-term side effects and zero long-term side effects, which he absolutely could not have known at the time, and now, as we look back at these events years later, we know is untrue, as the AstraZeneca vaccine was withdrawn from the market in 2024, very likely due in part to it being related to thrombocytopenia syndrome, TTS, in extremely rare cases. TTS is a clotting condition that can potentially be life-threatening. Although AstraZeneca stated that the reason for their withdrawal was due to an inability of the vaccine to continue to protect against new variants, vaccine-related TTS was linked to up to 81 deaths in the UK by the time of its removal from the market. The vaccine wasn't the only thing that was withdrawn, as so too was this paper, for no stated reason, again in March of 2021, presumably because the information was quickly becoming out of date, and thereby arguably, misinformation itself. A paper published by Grech in October of 2020, COOF, a global and continental overview of the second wave and its relatively attenuated case fatality ratio, was also amongst the papers withdrawn in March for no specified reason. But as the original page has been deleted, and the DOI replaced with the withdrawal notice, and no copy appears to have been backed up on Sci-Hub or elsewhere, there's no easy way for anyone to access this paper anymore, unless you already happened to have saved a copy during the 5 months that it remained live. Other papers that have no remaining backup and exist only as withdrawal notices are Sports and Sportsmen as role models or otherwise in the COOF era, the Spanish flu, COOF and Malta's reactions, contrasts and similarities, vaccine hesitancy in Maltese family physicians and their trainees vis-a-vis influenza and novel COOF vaccination, and vaccine hesitancy in the University of Malta faculties of health sciences, dentistry, and medicine vis-a-vis influenza and novel COOF vaccination. Again, with the original papers deleted and without a publicly available backup, the contents of these papers are lost to the broader scientific community and the community at large. But given the similarity between Grech's actual medical papers published in the EHD, as we're going to look at, I can likely guess what they did consist of. Probably short reviews of others' work without any unique scientific contributions. I say we can likely guess because several papers, including COOF, combine supply-side and demand-side shocks, so lift restrictions carefully lest GDP declines ultimately kill more than the COOF, also published in October in Early Human Development, alongside the rest, was uploaded to Sci-Hub before the original page was deleted and the original DOI removed. In this paper, Grech provides evidence from the US and UK, alongside global economic forecasts that illustrate the extreme costs of maintaining strict lockdowns, as well as the medical consequences of such stringency, leading to delays in cancer diagnosis and treatment. This paper is a brief summary of the economic issues posed by lockdowns, while still cautioning about the public risks of removing all restrictions. Grech retracted this paper in March along with the others, perhaps because it just doesn't add anything to the broader academic record, being a simple literature review. This exact same scenario occurred with another paper published in the EHD in October and retracted in March, COOF, Mathematical Estimation of Delay to Deaths in Relation to Upsurges in Positive Rates, with the original page deleted and only the withdrawal notice, bereft of rationale, left in its place. But this too was backed up on Sci-Hub. The paper is another short review of extant literature suggesting that there is a 20-day staggered delay between spikes in rates of infection and mortality. There is no new research presented, which, again, may have been why this too was retracted, although with zero clarification, that's merely my best guess, given the increasing scrutiny that was being placed on Grech's work in the EHD. Other papers with a deleted landing page, leaving the only remaining public evidence of their existence being the same boilerplate, reasonless notice of their withdrawal, published in October or November of 2020 and retracted in March of 2021 are The Possible Shape of Things to Come, Holidays Over, a review of actual school outbreaks up to September 2020, Malta tourism loses due to second wave, Needed, less influenza jab hesitancy and less presentism amongst healthcare workers in the COOF era, To Wear or Not to Wear, adherence to face mask use during the COOF and Spanish influenza pandemics, theoretical novel jab risk of rare and severe adverse events versus mortality, and some health effects of global warming, the latter of which is not about the COOF, although it does mention it, and is similarly simply a 6 short paragraph long summary of extant literature, calling for more work to be done on the subject, presumably by someone else, the scientific equivalent of a Wikipedia page stub. Well, he does seemingly like writing wiki articles. In fact, the Wikipedia page for Voyager's emergency medical hologram mentions Grech's work directly. But what's more is that I don't think he's responsible for that addition, as the reference was added by an editor under the pseudonym Edwin of Northumbria, who claims to be an Englishman with a background in mathematics and psychology. These papers have all been backed up to Sci-Hub and are all nothing more than literature reviews, presenting no new data. there are a few papers out of those submitted to the EHD that could have arguably contributed anything of scientific interest to the broader community, one of which was one of COOF's many costs, Malta's expenditure in consumables and non-consumables, a population-based study, which is still just a description of how Malta's modern-day state hospital reacted to the pandemic by purchasing new equipment and how much it cost the Maltese government. The rest of the paper is a simple overview of the underpreparedness of global health systems. Again, the only potential value here is that it provides figures for medical spending from a small island nation, and hence likely why it was withdrawn. The same can be said of sharp decline in acute and elective hospital attendances and admissions due to COOF in Malta, Q1 2020, a population-based study, which compares internal hospital data from modern day from before and during the pandemic, illustrating, as the title states, a decline in hospital admittance rates during what was anticipated as a major health crisis, likely due to limited human contact. It's just not that scientifically interesting. Another that provided some potentially unique information, if of limited value, is safe school reopening under restrictions, measures implemented in San Andrea Independent School in Malta, which again just describes the measures taken by the school to mitigate infection, including distance learning, thermal screening, mask mandates, hygiene and cleanliness, counseling services, and reopening procedures. Again, there's not much of interest here, but it may not have been reported on elsewhere in a cohesive format, simply because Malta is such a small country with about 500,000 residents. Much of the same can be said about jab hesitancy amongst Maltese healthcare workers toward influenza and novel vaccination, which presents survey data from the staff members of Modern Day on their own jab hesitancy. Another one of the only studies that contains anything approaching new data, the way in which the COOF changed behavior on social media in Malta, is an analysis of 50,000 Facebook comments and 150,000 interactions scraped from the social media service. The emotions expressed in posts and responses were determined via qualitative sentiment analysis, as well as quantitative assessment of reactions in the form of Facebook emojis. Grech and his co-authors found a 200% increase in online chatter early in the pandemic in Malta, and a 300% increase in posts expressing care, affection, and unity. Increasing case numbers were related to increased emotional talk and reactions to the virus, as one would expect. This is probably the only paper out of all of Grech's withdrawn and retracted work that brings anything new to the table, and it's a sentiment analysis of Facebook posts. The only other paper in this lot in which the original DOI page wasn't deleted, leaving the paper still accessible, is another one regarding mortality estimates. Unknown of unknowns, COOF and potential global mortality, which was one of Grech's earliest COOF publications, posted in March of 2020, which was also retracted after the bulk of them were in March of 2021, and instead was retracted in June of 2021 due to the information being deemed as out of date, being similarly based on early WHO data, as were his severity estimates. In it, Grech predicts that the COOF will result in a near 6% mortality rate across the entire global population.
Wrong, 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 wrong. Wrong, 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 wrong.
By mid-2021, this estimate was clearly unaligned with reality, as a paper published in April from Ioannidis 2021, as just one example, placed the global infection mortality rate in hindsight at 0.15% out of a total estimated 1.5 to 2 billion infections. Grech's prediction made the previous year would have meant, at the upper limits of infection, 120 million dead, rather than around 3 million, as it would turn out in actuality. Grech therefore was off in his estimation by a factor of 40. The estimate is closer to reality for early case fatality rates than it is for later figures, but the fatality rate of confirmed cases was significantly higher during the earliest waves, with 2023 estimates placing the rate higher than that of the seasonal flu, with the CFR at around 1% for the COOF and 0.1% to 0.3% for influenza, but that's even a further cry from the 6% predicted by Grech in 2020. Completing our coverage of the retracted papers or papers surrounding, such as the global warming one, we have Novel Research Opportunities, an Unfortunate Small Silver Lining, and its sequel, Novel Research Opportunities 2, an Unfortunate Silver Lining, which I think are important to draw some extra attention to because they seem to be a public admission by Grech that what he was doing was opportunistic. In both papers, Grech describes how it had been a boon for scientists because of the new avenues for research that it had opened up. And we know what Grech considers to be research by now is at best scraping data from Facebook or simple surveys from the hospital at which he worked, and at worst, summaries of related topics or sci-fi blog posts. The contents of both papers are otherwise themselves summaries of some of the literature reviews Grech published elsewhere in the Journal of Early Human Development. I might have thought that these papers were indicative of some sort of self-reflection on Grech's part, admitting that he was using the chaos of COVID to dump a load of low-quality work into the ether, improving his CV in the process, but he doesn't say as much in so many words, and again, the contents are just a review of the reviews he previously published as their own papers. Perhaps on some level this was an admission of guilt, but it could also have been an attempt at obfuscation. The mass of retractions of Grech's COVID papers in March of 2021 was likely due in part to public criticisms of his work from a human sciences undergraduate student at Oxford, Hampton Gaddy. Gaddy has gone on to earn a Master's of Philosophy and as of 2025 is a PhD student at the London School of Economics. But back when he was still an undergrad, Gaddy wrote a letter to the editor of Early Human Development in expression of his concern with Grech's prolific publications in the journal. The letter has been removed from Gaddy's GitHub, but excerpts remain on Retraction Watch. Gaddy noticed the same problems that I have pointed out here, that Grech's papers were, frankly, unscientific, being little more than literature reviews, tips for publication, or just ramblings about Star Trek, with Gaddy similarly finding them to, quote, read like a blog or the notes of a university course. Another thing that Gaddy noted in his letter was Grech's tendency to cite himself, which improves his H-index score, a simple calculation made by the number of articles a scientist has published by how many times each of those articles has been cited. An author with a H-index of 5, therefore, means that he or she has published 5 papers that have been cited at least 5 times. By heavily citing his own work of minimal scientific value, Grech was not just artificially inflating his total number of publications, but also his H-index. Specifically, as Gaddy states, quote, of the 401 articles that have cited Grech's work since 2018, 118 were published in the EHD. Of those 118 articles, Grech was co-author on 84 of them. Of the remaining 34 articles that do not include Grech as a co-author, 26 had at least one author affiliated with the University of Malta or its associated hospital. As such, not only was Grech polishing up his CV in the process, it seems fellow academics affiliated with the University of Malta were similarly contributing to what very much seems like an opportunistic attempt to bolster Grech's bona fides. Even with the 29 papers on COVID, 48 WASP papers, and 16, technically 17 Star Trek papers all withdrawn or retracted, Grech's H-index as of 2025 is 34, compared to 2020 when he had a H-index of 23. Similarly, the number of citations to Grech's name has more than doubled since 2020, from 2,522 to 5,672 in 2025. In total, Grech has published 517 papers, of which 94 have been retracted or withdrawn, 18%, nearly a fifth of his total curriculum vitae. Grech completed his medical degree from the University of Malta in 2002, and to date his most cited paper is one he published while still a medical student, which looks and sounds quite a bit different from the rest of the work that we've examined here, as you can tell from the title alone. Genotype-phenotype correlations of NPHS1 and NPHS2 mutations in nephrotic syndrome advocate a functional interrelationship in glomerular filtration, published in February of 2002, which has been cited 389 times. His 4 most cited papers were all published during or shortly after the completion of his degree, between 1999 and 2004, with the top 5 being rounded out by WASP parametric versus non-parametric tests. Grech stopped submitting papers to Early Human Development in 2021, with his most recent non-withdrawn publication in the journal being Assisted Reproductive Technology and Multiple Pregnancy in Malta, a population-based study. As this paper is well within the journal's scope, and at least somewhat contributes to the totality of scientific knowledge, tracking the rate of multiple births in Malta in combination with the use of fertility treatments, it remains published in the EHD. His most recent related paper was published on the 27th of June 2025, titled Sex Ratio at Birth in Northern Ireland During the COOF Pandemic, a comparison with published data from the Republic of Ireland, England, and Wales, and published in the American Journal of Human Biology. He largely switched his research focus from to the topic of this more recent paper, sex ratios at birth, around 2023. While I suppose you could call this research, you have to squint a bit to see it as such, as all it consists of is going through hospital databases to see how many babies were born that year and cataloging their sex. Really just groundbreaking stuff. Since his final publication in the EHD, Grech has published a total of 83 papers, none of which have been withdrawn or retracted, fairly quickly rebuilding from the papers lost during the COVID-era research gold rush, again mostly concerning sex ratios at birth. But these too are of dubious scientific quality, reporting on nothing more than basic statistics, and with many still with bizarre, attention-grabbing titles or attempts to make the papers seem like more than what they are, with one paper, for example, being titled "No Birth-Sex Ratio Changes in the United States in 1977 Following Elvis Presley's Death," published in March of 2025, and concludes that the death of Elvis Presley, in fact, did not lead to changes in the biological sex of newborns, which really just begs the question as to what the impetus was behind this paper. If he thinks the sexual demographics of the population might have changed just because a fat guy died, then I wonder what he expects will happen when George R.R. Martin pops his clogs, sometime after never finishing the next entry in the Song of Ice and Fire franchise.
A great fantasy should really be about talking about the world in a bigger sense. You're doing that, aren't you, in this stuff?
Yeah, well, I'm certainly trying to do that, yeah, that's...
At least he hasn't published another Star Trek paper in an academic journal since 2020, I suppose, but he's now academically shitposting about Elvis and publishing papers like this, encouraging academics to rethink using Microsoft Excel's forecast function for statistical analysis and creating, in his words, bespoke spreadsheets. As of August of 2025, Victor Grech has fallen from his position on the list of the 30 most retracted authors on Retraction Watch, with his total of 29 official retractions placing him at his worst in the 24th position. The scholar in last place on the list as of the time of this writing and recording has 32 official retractions. However, if you broaden the definition of retraction to include all of the withdrawals, Grech would place in the top 10, and in terms of official retractions, he doesn't fall that far behind Didier Raoult, who also officially only has 46 retracted papers, but was involved in so many scandals that it took me 3.5 hours to cover them all. Ultimately, it's hard to say how much harm Grech really did to academia as a whole through his fairly clearly opportunistic approach to the pandemic. But before we close this story, let's learn a little bit more about the man behind the papers, the facts behind the science fiction. Victor Grech is an interesting scientific figure to say the least. And while it's difficult to imagine any other reason for his mass publication of low-quality papers in the EHD, and his continual publishing of papers with a limited capacity to contribute to the field of pediatrics, besides that of opportunism and self-enhancement, one could never say that he is a man bereft of passion. Perhaps the problem is that Grech has a little bit too much of it, spreading himself thin between his many hobbies and interests. From holding a black belt in karate, which he practices several times a week along with Krav Maga, to creating impressionistic works of art, to his clear love of science fiction, Dr. Grech is a man of many talents. He held a solo exhibition featuring around 170 paintings at Valletta Mediterranean Conference Center, inspired by other Maltese artists such as John Borg Manduka, and another exhibition that featured his work, Malta Impressions, supported charities such as Beating Hearts Malta, a foundation for congenital heart defects, which was the focus of one of Grech's doctorates. In recognition for his charitable work, in 2019, Grech was made a Knight of Grace by the Order of the Knights of Malta, Hospitaller. He is, in fact, a knight, and holds several medical and other advanced degrees. He completed his first doctorate of medicine in 1988 from the University of Malta, holds non-medical PhDs from the University of Malta and the University of Portsmouth, specializing in the depiction of infertility in science fiction, a cardiology degree from the University of London, a diploma in child health, and is a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians and the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health. Until recently, he was the only pediatric cardiology specialist in Malta, and he speaks Maltese, English, and Italian fluently. Again, Grech is unquestionably a man of many talents and many interests, and while he may not have contributed much of particularly unique value to the field of pediatrics, he always seems to have a positive message for fellow scholars and people in general, from his perhaps saccharine words of encouragement across his many papers to him saying of Krav Maga that, quote, "If I can do it, anyone can. I started at 50. Regarding his personal life outside of his hobbies, Victor is married to a pharmacist and is a father of 2, including a daughter similarly pursuing medicine, which has given him some very personal experience with his own area of scientific focus, telling the Synapse magazine in 2016 that, quote, "The scariest bit of being a pediatrician and a parent was waiting for my children to be born, knowing that there were a million things that could go wrong, and praying that none of them would touch our babies. Yes, indeed, ignorance is bliss in this kind of situation, and knowing all about what can possibly go wrong is definitely not always helpful." In addition to being a proud father, Grech is also a cat person and owns 3 Siamese. Grech became fascinated with science and science fiction from an early age, getting hooked on the works of Hugh Walter when he was about 7 years old, and would go on to read thousands of science fiction books across his lifetime. By his estimation, he owns over 1,500 books and a near-complete collection of every issue of Analog, a science fiction magazine published from 1938 to the present. His favorite author is Robert Heinlein, based, but he also has been greatly inspired by the works of John Varley and John Campbell. And this love for science fiction also extends to Japanese anime, particularly the mecha genre. Grech had an early interest in astrophysics and cosmology, which he wanted to pursue as a career but instead pursued medicine because there were no Bachelors of Science degrees available at the university when he was an undergraduate, stating that he, quote, "did not want to be a doctor at any point. I never had this calling," but that he was not unhappy with his decision because medicine allowed him to study a wide variety of subjects and meet many different people. As to why he chose to specialize in pediatrics, Grech told journalist Leah Hogg that it appealed to him because babies cannot speak and children do not have complex ulterior motives for behavior, which makes working with them refreshing compared to adults who can and often do lie to physicians. Speaking of cardiology, he relates it to both plumbing and physics. Plumbing because it's a simple way of understanding how heart valves function, and physics because, well, it was one of his first academic passions. He told Synapse that, in his early 40s, he had something of a midlife crisis, which compelled him to take up painting as a method of turning off the stressors of daily life. Upon concluding her interview with Grech, Synapse reporter Marika Azaparty said that, quote, "A strangely vivid image of Goldrake and Mazinger Z, flying through a Monet-like seascape, accompanies me home." In my personal opinion, Grech seems to have just gotten a bit carried away during the coup, seeing an opportunity to improve his own credentials while also publishing about the things that he was interested in, namely the scientific method and science fiction, and it's hard to castigate him for his passion. However, in pursuit of that passion, he kind of destroyed the credibility of an academic journal and landed himself a position, at least at one point, as one of the top 30 most retracted academics in the world, only falling from that position because his competition is just so much more egregious. Whatever the real reason for the era publications, Grech hasn't stopped working, even if his more recent work is only of slightly higher quality than the deluge of papers that he dumped in the Journal of Early Human Development for a few years straight. While I've certainly mocked Grech's Star Trek papers, mostly for the absurdity of them being published in a medical journal, because it is absurd and the entertaining hook for this story, I don't think Victor Grech is in any way a bad guy. I think he very genuinely cares about science and science fiction alike, and he is undeniably something of a Renaissance man as well as seemingly just a genial person. Maybe that's why the editors of the EHD published all those Trek papers. He's just kind of a cool guy, or maybe because he could kick their asses in Krav Maga. I wouldn't want anyone to come away from this video with a particularly bad impression of Grech just because he did something really weird, even if that really weird thing could have caused some minor harm to the body of science. It was mostly superficial damage to the ship's hull. My purpose in covering this subject is less to castigate Grech, although there were some serious issues regarding the COOF publications that I think did need addressing, and more to provide a peek behind the curtain of academia. This dude isn't a wizard, he's just a regular guy with regular hobbies that he's deeply passionate about, and that passion just so happened to produce some unintentionally bizarre results. But he's also a philanthropist, an artist, a fighter, and a man of great imagination, to say the least. If I had to apply one word to describe Grech himself and this entire debacle then, it would be this: fascinating. But hey, what do you guys think? Do you think that what Grech did was malicious, opportunistic, misguided, or innocent? Did things just get out of hand during the pandemic? Is Grech worthy of criticism for publishing his Star Trek papers in a medical journal, or do you agree with the editors that it was just a unique attempt to increase interest in the publication? Most importantly, and I'm sure the burning question in all of your minds, who is the best Star Trek captain and why is it Captain James T. Kirk? The consolation prize obviously goes to Captain Catherine Janeway for being a female driver. Let me know what you think in the comments down below because I genuinely am curious, particularly about that last question because I know that's going to start some arguments, and because it really helps the video out in the algorithm so more people get a chance to see it. If you liked the video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe if you're not already subscribed for more content about the intersection of science, academia, and culture. If you would like to hear more from me, I do a weekly news and politics podcast on the Broken Crown channel with my co-host Spoon, linked in the description, along with a link to my sponsor, also in the pinned comment, and links to support my work on Patreon and Subscribestar. For just $1 a month, you'll have your name included at the end of every video, and get access to my Discord where we do watch parties to preview all of these videos before they're released on YouTube, and can just generally hang out in our little nerdy community. If you'd like something a bit more tangible for your support, you can purchase something from my merch store, also linked in the description, with plenty of options for social science swag. I obviously had to make a new design to go along with this video because, well, I love Star Trek, and any excuse to talk about it. So, thank you all so much for watching, Diethra, Altana Volt, Dif Torhes Musma, and Socha, Edif.
Senior ship surgeon since 66, multi-talented, knows all the tricks, been almost everywhere in the galaxy, travel time and change history.